Why did the room feel smaller the moment her name appeared on the guest list, like the walls themselves were holding their breath? They barely remembered her. That was the strange part. Not the way she stayed late cleaning tools no one else touched. Not how she carried everyone's unfinished work so the instructors wouldn't ask questions. They remembered just enough to turn her into an idea, a punchline with a past. The quiet girl, the workshop ghost, the one who never fought back. Inviting her felt harmless, almost generous. They told themselves that as champagne chilled and playlists looped through curated nostalgia, as they rehearsed speeches meant to sound humble but land flattering, as they congratulated each other for how far they'd come, careers, houses, followers, proof that life had rewarded the right people. Her name sat at the bottom of the spreadsheet. Nora Keltridge, no profile photo, no LinkedIn flex, no visible proof that she mattered. That was why it worked. If she came, she'd be contrast. If she didn't, she'd be absence. Either way, the story stayed theirs. What they didn't account for was the sound. The low, unfamiliar thrum that vibrated through the glass atrium before anyone saw anything at all. Not music, not traffic, something heavier, purposeful. The laughter near the bar faltered. Someone joked about construction outside. Then the floor trembled just enough to turn heads. The doors hadn't opened yet. When they finally did, the wind came first, sharp, commanding, and then the shape filled the entryway, rotors slowing like a predator choosing stillness over speed. It wasn't a limo. It was an Apache. And stepping down from it was not the girl they remembered. Nora stood alone for a moment beneath the wash of rotating lights, boots steady on polished stone, posture easy in a way that couldn't be practiced. She didn't scan the room, didn't hesitate. She already knew where she was. People froze because something in her presence disrupted the narrative they'd prepared. She wasn't overdressed or underdressed. She wore plain clothes that fit like function mattered more than impression. Short hair, no jewelry, a faint scar along her forearm that caught the light and didn't apologize for it. This wasn't an entrance meant to impress. It was arrival. No one clapped, no one spoke, because somewhere instinct recognized what ego could not. This woman had stood in worse rooms. And survived. She crossed the atrium without urgency, past faces that searched her for signs of the girl they used to know. They didn't find her. They found someone else entirely, someone quieter, heavier, carved by time instead of softened by it. Nora Keltridge had come back, but not as proof. As presence. And not one of them yet understood what that meant. What does it do to you when the people who once erased you suddenly need you for their story? Nora read the invitation twice, once with her eyes, once with her memory. The paper was expensive, the wording careful, familiar without being personal. They hadn't written her because they missed her. They wrote because time had turned cruelty into nostalgia and nostalgia into theater. She didn't tear it up. That surprised even her. Instead, she set it down on the steel table of her garage workspace, between a coil of paracord and a half-restored dive helmet. The space smelled like oil and quiet. The kind of quiet that only comes after years of learning when silence is safer than explanation. Her reflection in the polished metal didn't look like the girl from Langford High. That girl had learned early how to disappear. This woman had learned how not to. She opened the locker with a thumbprint. Inside, no dresses, no masks, just tools, gear, and a folded navy working blouse she hadn't worn since the discharge. The name patch still read Keltridge. She didn't touch it. Some memories didn't need reopening to stay alive. The incident overseas still lived in her body. The wrong step, the blast wall, the moment when leadership becomes consequence instead of title. Two teammates didn't come home. She did, with fragments in her leg and questions no one could answer cleanly. She'd been called brave, she felt broken. The invitation wasn't about that version of her either. They remembered a girl who didn't defend herself, who absorbed jokes like static, who took blame because it ended things faster. They didn't know what it meant to carry a man twice your weight through smoke while your hands shook, and you did it anyway. They didn't know what silence costs when it's chosen. She folded the invitation and slid it back into the envelope. Not acceptance, not refusal, just acknowledgement. The date on the calendar was already circled. Her mentor had marked it years ago before illness took him. He used to say some places don't deserve closure. They deserve truth. Nora exhaled slowly and returned to her bench. She didn't plan what she'd say. She never did. Why does a room full of confident people grow uneasy when someone they underestimated walks in without asking permission? The Langford Heritage Arts Center looked expensive in the way only repurposed history can. Brick walls dressed up with lighting, old authority softened by aesthetics. The crowd moved in practiced loops. Everyone knew where to stand, who to talk to, which stories sounded impressive without sounding desperate. Nora entered without disrupting the flow, and somehow disrupted everything. She didn't wear a name tag, declined politely when offered one. She didn't need it. The room already knew who she was supposed to be. What unsettled them was that she didn't try to perform it. She moved along the outer edge, absorbing without engaging. Her eyes tracked exits out of habit. Her posture remained loose, alert, not defensive, ready. People whispered her name like a question. She stopped near the memorial table, photos of classmates lost too young, candles flickering like small, stubborn refusals. She nodded once, quiet respect, no ceremony. At the center of the atrium, a microphone waited. She understood then. The timing, the wording, the casual cruelty dressed as inclusion. A surprise testimonial. No warning, no context, a stage and expectation, the kind of setup meant to make someone stumble. She felt something tighten in her chest, not fear. Recognition. At exactly 7:59 the lights shifted, the sound softened, the crowd turned. Nora stayed where she was. Rowan Hale stepped forward, voice smooth, practiced, talking about growth, about journeys, about honoring everyone. Then he said her name. She let the silence stretch before moving, not to punish, to breathe. When she walked toward the podium, she did so without haste, without apology. They expected hesitation, they got stillness. She adjusted the microphone once, looked out at faces that searched for weakness. She didn't give them one. Let me tell you something. 5 words, calm, unadorned, heavy. She spoke of memory, of invisibility, of hallways that emptied when she entered, not accusing, just accurate. She told them she wasn't their redemption arc. Then she reached behind the podium and unfolded the trident banner. The air changed. She didn't boast, she didn't explain. She honored one person, a teacher who had seen her without demanding performance. And then she walked away. No applause followed, only understanding too late to be useful. What happens when the story you planned collapses, and you're left facing the truth without edits? They didn't know what to do with themselves after she left the stage. Rowan tried to laugh it off. The sound landed flat. Mara stared at the podium like it had betrayed her. Trent's phone hung uselessly at his side. A man in uniform stepped forward from the back of the room. His presence was quiet but unmistakable. He spoke without raising his voice. That wasn't a speech, he said. That was restraint. They bristled, defensiveness masquerading as confusion. She didn't name any of you, he continued, and yet you all recognized yourselves. When he said she'd saved his life twice, something fractured. Not pride. Certainty. Another figure joined him near the exit, another operator, another silent confirmation. Nora hadn't come alone. She hadn't needed to. The room thinned as people left, unsure how to process what they'd witnessed. The curated evening dissolved into something raw and unfinished. Later, the uniformed man returned alone. He walked to the podium and placed a folded American flag beneath the banner, set her name tape on top. No speech, no explanation, just acknowledgement. He left the same way he came. Quietly. Why do some truths stay behind long after the people who carried them have gone? The flag remained. No one touched it. Days later, photos surfaced online. Alumni noticed. Questions followed. Someone remembered an essay she'd written. Someone else found an old clip where she helped quietly without credit. A thread resurfaced. A soldier searching for the woman who saved his unit. He'd never known her name. Until now. She didn't respond, didn't correct the record, didn't step forward. She wasn't trying to be found. She'd already moved on. At the school, students began leaving small items near the podium. Notes, tags, tokens of gratitude for people who never needed recognition. Not because they knew her, but because they recognized her. Sometimes the strongest return isn't loud. It doesn't demand apology or admiration. It stands, speaks once, and leaves. Because dignity doesn't ask to be seen. It simply acts. Why did the envelope feel heavier than it should have? Like it carried more than paper. Like it carried a decade she'd already survived once. Nora Keltridge didn't open it right away. She set it down on the steel work table as if it might speak if handled too quickly. The garage was quiet except for the ticking sound of cooling metal. Evening light filtered through the narrow window, catching on the edges of tools lined with care rather than pride. This place wasn't decorated. It was prepared. There was a difference. She wiped her hands on a rag and stared at the invitation as if it were a live thing. Faux parchment, rose gold ink, fonts that tried to feel sincere while saying nothing real. It smelled faintly of cologne and printer toner, of people who still believed presentation was substance. She read it once, then again. We've been reflecting deeply. That line made her breathe out through her nose, reflecting, as if memory were a shared activity, as if silence had been mutual. She hadn't heard from anyone in 10 years, not when she left town with her things packed in a borrowed truck, not when the rumors followed her out like static, not when she enlisted, not when her name disappeared from class updates and alumni newsletters. Silence had been the agreement, one they were now pretending never existed. Nora leaned back against the workbench and closed her eyes. For a moment, she was 17 again, standing in the workshop with oil-stained hands while laughter bounced off the walls behind her. Someone had unplugged her soldering iron that day too. She'd fixed it without comment. She always did, because reacting only gave them something new to take. She opened her eyes and looked around the garage. This wasn't that girl's life. In the corner sat a disassembled Navy Mark V dive helmet, mid-restoration. On the far wall, a shadow box held mission patches she never talked about, not because they were classified, but because they were personal. On a shelf above her bench rested a sealed black duffel with faded unit tags and a cracked zipper that refused to die. The smell of cordite still lingered in its seams if you knew how to find it. She picked up the invitation again and noticed the line near the bottom. Selected to give a surprise testimonial. Her jaw tightened just slightly. A surprise, no warning, no preparation. A stage handed to her like a dare. She understood the tactic immediately. It wasn't overt cruelty. It was social engineering. Put her in the spotlight. Let the old dynamic do the rest. Let nerves turn her into the girl they remembered. They still thought pressure made her fold. Nora stood and walked to the locker at the back of the garage. The biometric lock clicked softly under her thumb. Inside hung a single uniform blouse, folded precisely, the fabric faded from use but clean. The name patch still read KELTRIDGE. No rank displayed. She hadn't worn it since the medical board, since the day they told her she'd done enough. She touched the edge of the fabric, then stopped herself. She wasn't going back as that version of herself either. Below the uniform sat a compact pair of binoculars clipped inside a matte black case. Beneath that, wrapped in cloth, was a bronze pendant shaped like a broken chain link. Not official, not ceremonial. Something a teammate had given her after Kandahar, when no paperwork could capture what had happened there. When two people didn't make it home, and one of them was her fault in ways she still woke up measuring. She closed the locker. The invitation slid back into its envelope, carefully folded, then placed beside a battered gear tag marked NISSTO contractor, KELTRIDGE, and someone else had circled the reunion date on the calendar in red ink years ago, her mentor's handwriting. He'd done it quietly, without explanation. "You don't go back for revenge," he'd told her once, voice rough from chemo and time. "You go back when you're no longer asking permission to exist." She hadn't planned on listening. But she hadn't erased the circle either. The night of the reunion arrived with clear skies and an unfamiliar calm. Nora dressed without ceremony, olive green shirt, black jacket, cargo slacks worn thin at the knees, boots built for impact, not style. She looked in the mirror once, not to check herself, but to confirm something deeper. She wasn't going to perform. She drove to the edge of town where a temporary landing zone had been marked earlier that day. The Apache waited there, rotors idle, crew already briefed. She nodded to the pilot and climbed aboard without comment. This wasn't an entrance for spectacle. It was logistics, timing, control. As the helicopter lifted, she felt the familiar weight settle into her chest. Not fear, focus. The kind that narrows the world into only what matters. Langford looked smaller from above. Streets she'd memorized by foot now reduced to geometry. The school, the courthouse turned art center, the parking lot where she'd once waited alone for rides that never came. The Apache circled once, then descended. When the doors opened, the wind hit first. It always did. She stepped down into the wash of light and sound, senses tuned without conscious effort. Every face inside the atrium turned at once. She felt it like a shift in pressure. This was the moment they'd imagined, just not the version they'd rehearsed. Nora didn't scan for familiar faces. She didn't need to. Her body already remembered where to move. She crossed the threshold and the noise dropped away, replaced by that peculiar hush that followed her into briefing rooms and forward operating bases. The silence that said something important had arrived. Inside, Rowan Hale watched her with a smile that stalled halfway into place. He recognized her, but not comfortably. Not the way one recognizes an old friend. More like the way you recognize a variable you forgot to account for. Mara Blenford lowered her glass slowly. Jesseline's perfectly manicured fingers paused mid-scroll. Trent leaned forward, eyes narrowing, recalculating. They saw her jacket, her boots, the way she moved like the room belonged to her even though she wasn't claiming it. "She looks different," someone whispered. No, she looked exact. Nora declined the name tag offered by a staff member with a small nod that said thank you without inviting conversation. She moved along the edge of the room, letting the current flow around her instead of through her. Old instincts. Stay out of the funnel. Observe before engaging. She stopped at the memorial table. Faces stared back at her from frames edged in soft light. Names she remembered. Names she didn't. Candles burned low, steady. She stood there for a moment longer than necessary, then inclined her head. She understood loss in a way this room could not. At 7:59 the lights dimmed. The bell chimed. The sound system hummed to life. She felt the shift in energy before anyone spoke. This was the moment they'd built toward. The reveal. The contrast. The quiet girl put on display. Rowan stepped to the podium and began his speech. Words flowed easily. Growth. Reflection. Journeys. Applause landed where it was supposed to. He spoke like a man accustomed to controlling outcomes. Then he said her name. Nora didn't move right away. She stood still, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, until the old instinct to rush, to apologize for existing, had no room to breathe. When she walked forward, it wasn't with defiance. It was with acceptance of who she had been, of who she was now, of the truth that some rooms never change but you can. She reached the podium and adjusted the microphone with a practiced hand, not shaking, not smiling, just present. She looked out at them, and for the first time she allowed herself to feel it all at once. The anxiety she'd once swallowed, the determination that had carried her through training, the pride she rarely named, the fractures that still hurt, the quiet hope that none of this would define her anymore. And then she spoke. Not yet explaining, not yet revealing. Just enough to make them listen. Because what came next wasn't about proving anything. It was about refusing to disappear ever again. Why did her heartbeat slow the moment she stood behind the microphone, when it should have been racing like it once did in every hallway of that school? Nora felt the quiet settle in her bones before she said anything else. Not the awkward quiet of people unsure when to clap, but the heavier kind, the silence that forms when a room realizes it no longer controls the moment. She could feel their attention sharpen, sense it like pressure behind the eyes. In another life, that attention would have crushed her. Tonight, it steadied her. She rested her fingers lightly against the podium, solid, anchored. She had leaned against worse things while the ground shook beneath her. "You don't remember me," she said, her voice calm enough to sound almost gentle. "Most of you don't." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd, dying quickly when she didn't smile to meet them. She wasn't fishing for reassurance. She was stating a fact, the kind facts don't argue about. "But I remember you." That landed differently. She felt it, a collective shift, spine straightening, shoulders tightening, because memory is easy when it flatters you. It becomes dangerous when it doesn't. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Years of briefing rooms had taught her that volume was a crutch. Precision mattered more. "I remember lockers slammed shut while my hands were still inside. I remember tools going missing 5 minutes before deadlines. I remember eating lunch in stairwells because it was quieter there." She paused, just long enough to let the images form. "Not because I was strange, but because I didn't know how to pretend." Her eyes moved slowly across the room, not accusing, just present. She wasn't hunting for reactions. She was letting them find themselves. "I didn't come here to reopen old wounds," she continued. "Some of them never closed. That's not something a stage fixes." Rowan shifted behind her. She could sense it without looking. The discomfort of a man realizing the script had slipped out of his hands. "You asked me to speak tonight," Nora said, turning slightly toward him now. 5 minutes, no warning, no context, just a microphone and a spotlight. She let that hang. "That's not an invitation, that's a test." A murmur spread. Someone near the back inhaled sharply. Someone else crossed their arms, defensive, like posture alone could shield them. "I'm not here to pass it," she said, "and I'm not here to fail it either." Her hand reached behind the podium, movements unhurried, deliberate. When she pulled out the folded trident banner, the air changed in a way she recognized immediately. Not excitement, recognition, respect, even from those who didn't fully understand what they were seeing. "I don't need this stage," she said quietly, holding the banner without flourish, "because I've stood on ones where every word carried weight you can't rehearse for." Images flickered behind her eyes without invitation, dust hanging in sunlight that shouldn't have been there, radios crackling, the sound a body makes when it hits the ground wrong. She didn't share those details. She didn't have to. They lived in the pauses between her sentences. "I've briefed teams who didn't get to ask questions," she went on. "I've watched people listen to me knowing some of them wouldn't come back. I've buried friends who were stronger than me in every way that counts." Her voice tightened then, just enough to be human, just enough to remind herself she still was. "And I didn't flinch," she said, "not once." She lowered the banner carefully onto the podium. But walking into this building tonight, her gaze lifted again, steady, that was harder. The room held its breath. "Because this is where I learned what it felt like to be small," she said. "This is where silence became survival, and it took me a long time to unlearn that." She didn't accuse them of bullying. She didn't name cruelty. She didn't need to. The truth had a way of finding its own shape. She turned her head then, scanning the rows until she found the face she was looking for. A woman seated near the back, shoulders rounded with age, hands folded carefully in her lap. The shop teacher. The one who'd never laughed. The one who'd noticed when Nora stayed late and never asked why. "Mrs. Whitcomb," Nora said, her voice softening, "you once told me I didn't need to be louder to be strong." The older woman's eyes filled instantly. She pressed a hand to her mouth, emotion breaking through years of professional composure. "You were right," Nora said. "Thank you." That was it. No triumphant ending. No dramatic crescendo. No demand for apology or acknowledgement. She stepped back from the microphone and nodded once, more to herself than anyone else. "That's my testimonial." For a moment, no one moved. Applause didn't come. Neither did boos, just stillness. Thick, unavoidable, the kind that forces people to sit with what they've just heard. Nora turned and walked away from the podium, without looking back. She didn't see Trent's phone lower slowly, his grin evaporating. She didn't see Mara's lips part without sound. She didn't see Jesseline's hands curl inward, nails pressing into her palms. She felt something else instead. Relief. Not the light kind, the earned kind. She reached the edge of the atrium just as a familiar presence entered through the side corridor. Boots, measured steps, the subtle awareness of someone who knew exactly where every exit was. He stopped near the back wall, blending into the shadows without trying. Their eyes met briefly. A nod, small, professional. "They know now," he murmured as she passed. Nora exhaled, the tension she hadn't named finally loosening its grip on her ribs. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Behind her, Rowan found his voice again, brittle around the edges. "Okay," he said, trying to reclaim control with humor. "So, that happened." No one laughed. Jesseline blinked, her polished confidence faltering. Was she serious? Mara stared at the podium like it had scorched her. She brought a navy flag. "Trident banner," the man at the back said calmly, stepping forward just enough to be seen. "There's a difference." They turned toward him, startled. He didn't raise his voice, didn't square his shoulders. He didn't need to. Stillness radiated from him the same way it had from Nora moments earlier. "That's earned," he continued, "not displayed." Rowan cleared his throat. "Right, but I mean, this was supposed to be celebratory." The man's gaze didn't waver. "Was it?" Silence again. "She didn't have to do that," Mara said finally, arms folding tight across her chest. "She could have just declined the invite." "That wasn't a performance," the man replied. "That was restraint." Trent scoffed under his breath. "She made us look like villains." "She didn't name a single one of you," the man said. "And yet all of you recognized yourselves." That cut deeper than accusation ever could. "You asked her for 5 minutes," he went on. "You handed her a microphone and a room full of ghosts. She told the truth without burning the place down." He paused, then added, quieter now, "If she'd faltered up there, I would have spoken for her." Rowan stiffened. "And who exactly are you?" The man met his gaze. "Someone who owes her his life, twice." That landed hard, not metaphorically, physically, like something heavy dropped into the center of the room, cracking the polished surface beneath their feet. Trent's smirk vanished. Jesseline swallowed. Mara looked away. Another figure stood from near the aisle then. A woman, similar posture, similar calm. She joined the man near the exit, their proximity speaking volumes without a word exchanged. Two of them. Nora hadn't come alone. Someone clapped once. Not loudly, not performatively, just honest. The sound echoed more than applause ever could. As people drifted away from the center of the atrium, conversations resumed in quieter tones, stripped of polish. The curated reunion had cracked, revealing something raw beneath it, something no one could quite define. Nora didn't re-enter the room. She stood outside beneath the cooling rotors of the Apache, night air brushing against her face. She closed her eyes for a moment and listened to her breathing, steady, grounded. She hadn't won anything. She hadn't lost either. She had spoken, and the world hadn't ended. Sometimes that was enough. And sometimes it was everything. Why did the room feel heavier after she left? As if something essential had been removed, and no one knew how to replace it. The atrium didn't return to normal. It tried. Music resumed at a lower volume. Staff adjusted lighting like brightness could fix what had dimmed inside people. Guests drifted toward the bar or the exits, speaking in softer voices, as though volume itself had become inappropriate. Rowan Hale stood near the podium, hands braced against the edge, staring at the trident banner as if it might explain itself if he waited long enough. This hadn't been the plan. None of it. The reunion was supposed to be a cleanse, a controlled narrative, a reminder that time had polished them into something worth admiring. Instead, it had exposed something they'd hoped age had buried. Jesseline broke the silence first, folding her arms with the practiced confidence that had once made her untouchable. She didn't have to say it like that, she muttered. That was pointed. Rowan didn't answer. His reflection stared back at him from the polished podium surface, older than he remembered, thinner around the eyes. She could have declined, Mara added, though her voice lacked conviction now, or at least warned us. Trent scoffed, packing once before stopping. She knew exactly what she was doing. That wasn't spontaneous. That was trained. Rowan finally nodded. Yeah, he said quietly, that's what scares me. Because they'd wanted vulnerability, tears, something they could frame as growth. Instead, they'd been handed composure, control, the kind of presence that didn't ask for permission and couldn't be edited. She wasn't trying to confront us, Rowan went on, more to himself than anyone else. She let us indict ourselves. No one argued. Across the room, the two uniformed figures remained near the exit, speaking quietly with heads inclined. They weren't scanning the room. They weren't watching the hosts. They were simply there, like anchors dropped into the space. Their presence made people uneasy, not because they were threatening, but because they were unmovable. Trent glanced toward them and lowered his voice. Do you think that was planned? The helicopter, the timing? Mara shook her head slowly. No, planned is different. Jesseline swallowed. It was prepared. That distinction settled over them like dust. Preparation meant intention, meant Nora hadn't come to react. She'd come to remain herself no matter what happened. That kind of readiness wasn't loud. It was terrifyingly quiet. Rowan straightened, forcing himself back into host mode. We should probably say something, acknowledge it. Say what? Trent snapped. That we miscalculated. That we underestimated her, Mara said. That we never really knew her, Jesseline added. The words tasted unfamiliar in their mouths. Vulnerability had always been something other people performed. Before anyone could respond, the man who'd spoken earlier stepped forward again. He hadn't raised his voice before. He didn't now. You can stop trying to reframe it, he said calmly. All four of them turned. This isn't content, he continued, and it isn't about you. Rowan bristled. We didn't mean. I know what you meant, the man replied. I've sat through briefings where people tried to make failure sound like strategy. This isn't that. Mara crossed her arms tighter. You don't know our history. I know hers, he said, and I know what it costs to walk into a room like this and not ask for anything. Jesseline's voice wavered despite herself. She made it sound like we were monsters. The man shook his head once. No, she made it sound like you were careless. That word landed harder than monster ever could. Careless with silence, he went on. Careless with power you didn't realize you had. Careless with someone who didn't know how to protect herself yet. Trent opened his mouth, then closed it again. You invited her to make yourselves feel evolved, the man said. She came because she'd already evolved past needing your approval. He paused, then added something softer. That doesn't make you villains, but it does make this uncomfortable. Sit with it. He stepped back toward the exit. Conversation finished. The room felt exposed without him there, like the last witness had just left. Minutes passed. People gathered coats. Some left without saying goodbye. Others lingered, unsure how to move on from something that hadn't offered resolution. Rowan noticed the banner still resting on the podium, unclaimed, untouched. What do we do with that? He asked quietly. No one answered. Eventually, the crowd thinned enough that the atrium echoed again, the old courthouse bones showing through the decor. A janitor pushed a mop bucket past the seating area, glancing briefly at the stage before continuing on, uninterested in the social aftermath. That was when the man returned. He entered through the side corridor alone this time, civilian jacket over his uniform, movements measured. He didn't look at the hosts, didn't scan the room. He went straight to the podium. From a matte black duffel slung over his shoulder, he removed a folded American flag, perfectly triangular, weighted with meaning no one in the room could fully claim. He placed it beneath the trident banner with deliberate care. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a name tape, black fabric, gold stitching. KLTRIDG. He set it gently atop the flag, not pinning it, not pressing it down, just placing it there as if to say this is where it belongs for now. No speech followed. He stepped down from the podium and turned to leave. An older man intercepted him near the aisle, hesitation written across his face. A former teacher, perhaps, or a coach, someone who had once believed proximity equaled understanding. Excuse me, the man said softly. She never talked much. The man with the duffel met his gaze. She didn't need to, he replied. She was always listening. He nodded once and continued on, boots echoing briefly before disappearing into the corridor. No one moved to touch the flag. Not out of respect alone, but out of uncertainty, as if claiming it required a kind of honesty they hadn't prepared for. The night wound down without ceremony. Staff packed decorations. Chairs were stacked. The curated playlist faded into nothing. But the podium remained. So did the flag. 2 days later, the maintenance crew found it exactly as it had been left, untouched, unclaimed. The event planner asked around, but no one had a clear answer. There was no paperwork, no directive, no explanation that felt sufficient. They left it there. When photos from the reunion went live, something unexpected happened. People noticed the flag, the name tape, the absence of explanation. Questions followed. Who was Nora Keltridge? Why hadn't anyone talked about her before? Alumni clicked her yearbook photo, dug through old archives, found traces they once ignored. A paper she'd written on the ethics of silence. A clip from graduation night where she handed the principal a bottle of water moments before he collapsed from heat exhaustion. Not dramatic, not loud, just present. Then someone found the post. An old thread buried deep in a forum, titled simply, "To the woman who saved my unit in Kandahar." The author had never known her name, only her voice, calm under fire, her hands steady while everything else burned. He described a medic who carried 3 wounded men to safety and disappeared before anyone could log her for commendation. The post had sat unanswered for years. Until now, a new comment appeared beneath it. Her name was Nora Keltridge. She wasn't trying to be found. The reunion committee never issued a statement. The event was quietly marked closed. The memory board was removed, but the podium stayed. And over the following weeks, students began leaving things beside the flag. Dog tags, notes, photographs, not because they knew her story in full, but because they recognized the shape of it. Someone who walked through the same halls and never asked to be seen. Someone who carried weight without noise. Sometimes the most important ceremonies aren't planned. They happen when people finally realize what they almost missed. Why did the quiet that followed feel more permanent than the noise that came before? Like something had shifted and refused to shift back. The days after the reunion passed without announcements or explanations. No follow-up emails, no public apologies. The committee closed the event file and moved on, at least on paper. But the building didn't forget. Neither did the people who had been there when the room changed. The podium remained where it was, tucked beneath the glass atrium like a held breath. Maintenance staff worked around it, careful not to disturb the folded flag or the name tape resting on top. No memo had been issued, but everyone seemed to understand instinctively that this wasn't something to be tidied away. Students began to notice. At first it was one or two, pausing on their way through the center, reading the stitched letters on the fabric. Keltridge, a name without context, without explanation, the kind of mystery that invites respect before curiosity. Someone left a pair of old dog tags beside the flag. No note, no signature, just metal worn smooth by time. Another student placed a folded photo the next day, a group shot from years ago, faces blurred, no labels. The offerings grew slowly, quietly. A kind of unspoken agreement formed around the podium. This was not a display, it was a reminder. Across town, Nora Keltridge returned to her routine without marking the moment. She rose early, ran before sunrise, let the rhythm of her breath settle the noise that sometimes followed her into sleep. The reunion had stirred things she hadn't planned to reopen, but she didn't regret it. Regret implied a wish to undo. She didn't. She spent the morning in her garage, finishing the dive helmet she'd left half restored. Her hands moved with practiced ease, tightening bolts, checking seals. Physical tasks helped her think, or helped her not think. Sometimes the distinction didn't matter. Her phone buzzed once on the workbench. A single message, unknown number. They found the post, thank you. She stared at the screen for a long moment before locking it and setting the phone face down. No reply. Gratitude didn't require conversation. It required acknowledgement. She'd already given that. By afternoon, she was on the road again, headed out of town toward a training site she wouldn't name and a job that wouldn't make headlines. That suited her fine. She learned long ago that impact and visibility weren't the same thing. Back at Langford, the ripple continued. Rowan Hale sat in his office staring at the metrics dashboard on his screen, numbers blurring together without meaning. Everstitch Collective was still struggling. The reunion had been meant to generate positive engagement, something clean to attach their brand to. Instead, the images circulating online told a different story. The podium, the flag, the name tape. People weren't sharing captions about nostalgia. They were asking questions about accountability, about silence, about who gets remembered and who gets erased. Rowan closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair. He thought about the moment Nora had paused before walking to the stage, the way she'd controlled the room without raising her voice. He realized something uncomfortable then. She hadn't needed them. They needed her. Jesseline felt it too, though she'd never admit it out loud. Her upcoming podcast appearance had been postponed, then quietly canceled. The producer cited tone concerns. Jesseline stared at her reflection in the mirror that morning, makeup immaculate, confidence fractured in a way she couldn't contour away. She replayed Nora's words in her head. "I'm not your redemption arc." It echoed uninvited, sharp and precise. Mara tried to turn the experience into content anyway. A reflective episode, a growth narrative. She recorded it twice, then deleted both versions. Something about speaking into a microphone after what she'd witnessed felt wrong, like trying to monetize a confession that wasn't hers to make. Trent avoided the subject altogether. He told himself it was overblown, that people online loved drama, but he stopped pulling out his phone at events, stopped recording without permission. For the first time, he noticed how often silence spoke louder than his commentary. None of them reached out to Nora. They didn't know how. And maybe, finally, they understood that knowing how wasn't owed to them. Weeks passed. The school administration debated removing the items from the podium. Liability concerns, optics. No one wanted to be responsible for a decision that might look like erasure. In the end, they left it, not out of courage, out of uncertainty. Students continued to add small tokens. A folded note that read, "Thank you for listening when no one else did." A set of worn earbuds, a medal from a local race. Symbols of endurance more than victory. Teachers noticed something else too, a shift in how students treated the quiet ones, not dramatically, not perfectly, but noticeably. Fewer jokes at someone else's expense, more pauses before laughter, awareness taking root where ignorance once lived comfortably. Change didn't announce itself. It seeped. Nora heard about the podium secondhand, weeks later, during a conversation that wasn't meant to be about her. A colleague mentioned it casually, like weather, like something that simply was now. She listened without comment, then changed the subject. That night, alone in her apartment, she took the bronze pendant from its cloth and held it in her palm. The broken chain link caught the light, edges worn smooth. She thought about the people she'd lost, the ones she'd saved, the ones she'd never know she'd affected. She set the pendant back down and turned off the light. She wasn't searching for closure. She learned that closure was a luxury afforded to people who'd never had to survive without it. The story kept moving without her. A former classmate posted a long thread about the reunion trying to unpack what had happened. Others chimed in, some defensive, some reflective, some silent. No one tagged Nora. They didn't need to. She had already said what she came to say. And in doing so, she'd left behind something stronger than a speech or a spectacle. She'd left permission. Permission to exist without performing. Permission to be strong without being loud. Permission to walk away without shrinking. Sometimes impact isn't measured in applause or recognition. Sometimes it's measured in what changes quietly after you're gone. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is speak once, then let the silence finish the work. Why did the ending feel unfinished, as if the story refused to close because it was never meant to belong to one night, or even to her? The podium stayed longer than anyone expected. By winter, the glass atrium had taken on a colder light, the kind that sharpened edges instead of softening them. The folded flag and name tape were eventually moved, not removed, but relocated to a small alcove near the old courthouse steps. No plaque explained it. No official narrative framed it. The items simply existed, and that felt intentional. People still paused there. Some stood longer than necessary, hands in pockets, eyes fixed on the stitched letters as if they were trying to read something between them. Others passed by quickly, uncomfortable with what couldn't be summarized or solved. Both reactions were honest. Nora never returned to see it. She was elsewhere by then. Another airfield, another early morning briefing where coffee tasted like metal and responsibility settled in before the sun rose. She listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, people listened. Not because of rank or reputation, but because she chose words the way others chose weapons, carefully, only when necessary. The work continued, training teams who would never know her full history, planning routes that would never make headlines, standing at the edge of operations where success looked like nothing happening at all. Some nights were harder than others. There were evenings when the past crept in uninvited, not the reunion, not the speeches or the looks, the older memories, the ones that still carried weight. She'd wake from sleep with her jaw clenched, heart steady but heavy, the way it gets when you've learned how to survive but not how to forget. On those nights, she didn't fight it. She sat up, breathed, let the quiet exist without trying to fix it. Strength, she'd learned, wasn't the absence of pain. It was the refusal to let pain dictate your shape. Back in Langford, the class of 2010 stopped talking about the reunion altogether. It faded from group chats, from casual conversation, from public memory. But something else replaced it. People began reaching out to one another differently, not with forced nostalgia or performative kindness, but with restraint, with awareness. A few former classmates quietly apologized to people they'd once overlooked, not loudly, not publicly. Some of those apologies were accepted, some weren't. That was okay too. The point wasn't absolution. It was acknowledgement. Rowan eventually shut down the reunion website. He archived the photos instead of deleting them. The image of the podium stayed in a folder labeled simply unedited. He never shared it again, but he didn't erase it either. It reminded him of something he'd missed for years, that leadership without reflection was just control dressed up nicely. Jesseline changed the focus of her career, not dramatically, not heroically. She stopped centering herself in every narrative she touched. It didn't fix everything, but it shifted something inside her she hadn't known was rigid. Mara took longer. Growth did that sometimes, but even she stopped trying to turn grit into branding. Some things didn't belong to algorithms. Trent never spoke publicly about that night, but people noticed he listened more, recorded less. Sometimes change didn't announce itself with declarations. Sometimes it arrived quietly, disguised as discomfort. At the school, a teacher replaced an old bulletin board with a simple phrase written in block letters. Silence has weight, choose how you carry it. No attribution. No explanation. Students asked about it. Teachers shrugged. It became one of those things that existed without ownership. Just like Nora had. One afternoon, months later, a first-year student stopped at the alcove where the flag had been moved. She stood there longer than most, backpack slipping from one shoulder as she stared at the name tape. Who was she? The student asked a passing custodian. The custodian considered the question, then answered honestly. Someone who didn't need to be loud. The student nodded, as if that was enough. And it was. Nora learned about none of this directly. Her life had narrowed again into logistics and timing, and the small, uncelebrated victories that defined her work. But something inside her had loosened since the reunion, even if she hadn't named it. She no longer felt the old pull when passing through towns that looked like Langford, no longer wondered if she should have said more, or less. She said what mattered. One evening, after a long day, she sat alone outside her quarters, watching the sky darken into something like peace. The air smelled clean. The world felt momentarily still. She thought about the girl she'd been, the one who carried other people's weight without complaint, the one who believed invisibility was safety. She didn't judge her anymore. That girl had survived long enough to become someone else. And that was enough. Nora took out the bronze pendant one last time, turned it over in her fingers, then tucked it back into her pocket. She stood, squared her shoulders, and went back inside. There was work to do. There always was. Somewhere far away, a young woman would walk into a room years from now and feel the instinct to shrink. Maybe she'd hesitate. Maybe she'd remember something she'd never been told directly, a story she'd never heard in full. And maybe she wouldn't disappear. Stories like Nora's didn't end with recognition or reward. They didn't need applause or closure. They lived on in subtler ways, in pauses, in changed behavior, in the quiet courage of people who learned they didn't need permission to take up space. The night of the reunion would fade into memory. The flag would eventually be placed somewhere official, or maybe it wouldn't. It didn't matter, because the real legacy wasn't the helicopter or the silence or the stunned faces in the atrium. It was the understanding that followed. That strength doesn't always announce itself. That resilience doesn't beg to be seen. And that sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.